Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on this 13th of March. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather and trusting us with your weather forecast, no matter what part of Alaska you're in. We appreciate the emails and the pictures you've been sending. I saw a nice picture of look like pretty whiteout conditions around Nunivak Island from Akkwx there. I would love to see more of those types of pictures from your part of Alaska, no matter what you're doing. Would like to see what it looks like where you are watching from tonight. So send me an email, a picture, or even video sometimes. We can use that and love to share it on the show next time around. david.snider@noaa.gov is how you reach me, and you can always check your forecast anytime online at weather.gov/Alaska or 1-800-472-0391. Of course, that's the Alaska Weather Information Line. The weather has quieted down for many locations across the state today, but in the lower Yukon Valley around Grayling and up toward McGrath, not going to be the case as we get back into tomorrow and Thursday. You're going to start to see some changes, and then by Thursday morning into Friday afternoon, a much better chance for accumulating snow. And this is going to be a decent helping of snow around the upper Kuskokwim and around McGrath. Could see as much as 7 to 12 inches of snow, and maybe as much as 17 inches in some places there. So a decent amount of snow around the upper Kuskokwim as we get into Thursday morning to about Friday afternoon. And then downriver a little bit toward the lower Yukon and Grayling, watch for the opportunity of 4 to 9 inches of snow. It looks like a decent blow of southwesterly flow is going to bring in a chance for some snow as we get into Thursday and into Friday. And you'll see why here in just a minute. Let's take a look at the satellite picture. We have a really broad trough of low pressure across the eastern Gulf of Alaska, and because of that, a substantial amount of heat has been moving into southeastern Alaska. Temperatures have been in the 50s around Juneau and in the 60s down south around Ketchikan, and it's probably not much of a stretch to say this is unseasonably warm for March. Don't be surprised if later on today we hear about record-setting temperatures in parts of southeast and maybe a widespread area as well. So if you think it's warm in southeast, you're absolutely right. Yes, indeed, it is warm. That southeasterly flow coming up the eastern Gulf is spreading moisture into the eastern interior as well. Not a whole lot of wind with that just yet. A little bit of a light snow from time to time, but a very progressive and active weather pattern continues out west as well. You'll notice this west and southwesterly flow coming in across the North Pacific and up the southwest coast. As that continues, we're going to see another wave after another wave after another wave moving in thanks to the southwesterly flow in the upper atmosphere, and you'll see that in the jet stream when we get to the aviation section here in just a minute. A lot of remnant snow showers and light snow continues across the west coast and the north slope. All of this is happening along a frontal boundary. It's just kind of parked right here across the west coast. So we've got snow up around Norton Sound. For your favorite dog sled trail, of course, still snow falling in that region, out across the Chukchi Sea into the Beaufort Sea coast, and low pressure across the Gulf. Not a whole lot of precipitation with this just yet, but a little bit of rain there across southern parts of the outer coast of southeast. Here's another storm wave coming its way across the Bering Sea with that. You see it's generating a little more snow as we get into tonight. Most areas out west are going to see generally light accumulations, if any. Snow showers in between the dashed lines here. Those are troughs of low pressure. And then as we get into south central, the Copper River Valley, into the Fairbanks region and the upper Yukon, all of that again is generally light snow. Nothing really much to write home about. We have an opportunity for some light rain in southeast, still very mild weather tonight. And another surge of warmth coming up across the central and eastern chain will likely bring rain and some wind to the Alaska Peninsula and all the way out toward the central chain as we get into your Wednesday afternoon. That low pressure system there, not terribly strong just yet, 1,001 millibars for that if you're keeping track. Out west, you can barely see the beginnings of the next wave coming across the western chain, and we'll keep snow showers in the forecast for many across the northern sections of south central, perhaps even in the Anchorage Bowl, all the way through the Alaska Range into the middle Yukon Valley and northward into the Kotzebue Sound region. And then low clouds and light snow, probably, maybe even just some flurries across the north slope. For southeast, it's rain and warm weather as we get into your Wednesday. Here's Thursday. Things dry out a little bit more in southeast. Watch for some high terrain snow showers there across the misty fjords. But look at what's going on in southwest now. All of a sudden, we have a really healthy southerly wind coming in across Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay. Looks like decent amounts of rain in that region, and still enough cold and moisture for some heavy snow. This is what's going to kick off that snow for areas around McGrath down to Grayling. And for the McGrath region and the upper Cusco, again, once again, 7 to 12 inches of snow, maybe as much as 17. Winter weather advisory in effect for you starting Thursday morning going through Friday, and the lower Yukon Valley down into Grayling, about 4 to 9 inches of snow. And again, that's Thursday morning to Friday afternoon. Out west, yet another wave. This is down to 991 millibars crossing the central chain. Ridge of high pressure, though, in between may slow things down just a little bit. Some drier air just north of the Yukon Valley itself, and light snow for the north slope, with more snow developing across parts of south central and the Kenai. Already seeing a wallop of snow earlier in the last 4 to 5 days or so. So an awful lot going on across the region, but that progressive pattern of weather still continues across the North Pacific and the Western Bering. In the meantime, high pressure is going to move into southeast, so we should start to chip away at the clouds. Wind won't be as much of an issue as we get toward the latter part of the week, but we're going to have to keep an eye on what this is doing out here across southwest, because as this gradually creeps eastward, that'll dramatically change the weather there for northern parts of southeast as we get toward the weekend, and then of course across the Copper River Valley as well. So an awful lot going on. As always, you can find all of these maps anytime at weather.gov/Anchorage/TV. And once we get around to the morning after the show, you can always wait for the next round, and we'll update those usually by about 4:30 or 5 o'clock each afternoon. So check these out if you want to go back and review. Of course, we'll show them at the end of the show as well. Now, temperatures tonight, pretty mild across southeast, mid to upper 30s, even 40s across the outer coast and the southern parts of the Panhandle, 20s and 30s across south central, 29 in Kodiak, teens and 20s for the interior, not terribly cold there at all. Up north, you're looking at overnight lows anywhere from 5 to 10 below. Seward Peninsula temperatures in the single digits, most areas from 0 to about 10. And the lower and middle Yukon valleys in the teens and 20s. McGrath looking at about 24, Bristol Bay, Dillingham, King Salmon, you're all in the mid-20s there. 29 in Kodiak, as I said. St. Paul 22, and upper 20s and lower 30s for most along the chain and into the Alaska Peninsula. 5 for Gamble and St. Lawrence Island. For high temperatures tomorrow up north, you're looking at single-digit temps from Barrow out toward Prudhoe Bay, Atkasuk, Kaktovik, actually a little bit on the warmer side there. Single digits and low to mid-teens for Kotzebue Sound. Kotzebue itself, 14 degrees, 10 in Nome. Teens and 20s for areas north of the Yukon, south into Lake Iliamna. Southwest, you're looking at low to mid-30s. Kodiak up to the 40-degree mark or better. Upper 30s and low 40s for south central. So another kind of slushy day on the road system down south. For southeast, look for temperatures back in the lower to mid-40s, perhaps not as warm as it was today, but it'll still be fairly mild. Out west, still above freezing for most locations, 31 in St. Paul and St. George. Overnight lows Thursday morning, 23 degrees there, single digits and teens for most of the interior, south central, upper 20s to mid-30s. As you get out into Bristol Bay, just shy of the freezing mark. Southeast, mid to upper 30s in most locations. Ketchikan and Annette, you're probably pushing the 40-degree mark by Thursday afternoon. Look for high temperatures back in the mid to upper 40s, south central above freezing, the interior a little bit below freezing, but pretty close around Fairbanks near 32, and single digits and teens for the north slope. Nome looking at a healthy 14 degrees by Thursday afternoon.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather now, several waves of low pressure will continue to pass over Alaska over the next couple days. We'll start out with MVFR in the eastern Gulf, south central, the Copper River Valley, the eastern interior, all looking at least MVFR and probably IFR with a few holes in between. Cook Inlet may start out with relatively clear conditions, but on land that will not be the case. IFR conditions stretch all the way from the Chukchi Coast, Kotzebue Sound region into eastern Norton Sound in the interior, Galena all the way down toward Lake Iliamna and into Bristol Bay, with the next wave already showing up on IFR for areas south of the eastern chain and into the northern Pacific, with MVFR widespread across the Bering Sea. That next wave coming in from the south and west will overtake most of the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern chain as we get into Wednesday afternoon. But notice widespread VFR conditions expected all the way from the Seward Peninsula through the YK Delta, Cook Inlet region, and Kodiak Island. So that may be your chance if you're needing to move quickly on Wednesday afternoon. MVFR conditions are expected across southeast, with IFR spreading through the Copper River Basin into the interior and Fairbanks, with IFR also stretching across the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range and parts of the Beaufort Sea. For Thursday morning, most of the north slope will be looking at MVFR, with hit-and-miss IFR conditions stretching from Wainwright up toward Barrow, and then just east of Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse out toward Kaktovik. IFR conditions are also expected across southwest, Kodiak Island again for Thursday morning, and southeast looking at MVFR conditions. with IFR once again moving into the west thanks to that next wave of weather. You can see that kind of stretching out a little bit more on Thursday with widespread IFR conditions though across the middle Koyukuk down toward the Kuskokwim, southwest and into south central Alaska once again, with southeast seeing some improvements after a day full of IFR around Chilkoot and White Pass. Here are your pass conditions though in detail for your Wednesday. Anaktuvuk and Anigan Pass we expect to lean over toward IFR conditions there as we go through your Wednesday. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass starting out at IFR with some improvement toward MVFR as the day goes on. Rainy Pass expecting to see IFR conditions there toward MVFR as we get into your afternoon tomorrow. IFR conditions for Windy Pass, for Isabel Pass expected there. Mentasta Pass we expect to see instrument flight rule to start the day with some improvements had there, and for Tanita Pass similar conditions. Portage Pass has started IFR with some improvements noted throughout the day, but Chilkoot and White Pass probably hold at IFR through a large part of the daytime tomorrow. Southward though it looks a lot better. There is some warm air aloft lingering across the western provinces of Canada and over southeastern Alaska, levels there between about 4,000 and 6,000 feet. And then you get into the next batch of weather that's coming in from the south and west. That's bringing levels up to about 2,000, maybe even 4,000 feet just south of Sandpoint toward Nikolsky and Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. The surface freezing line is just west of the Pribilofs. You can see most of the mainland is below freezing tomorrow morning. Icing potential is kind of hit and miss. You'll notice anywhere from 6,000 to about 9,000 feet and below from the Chukchi Coast through the interior, through the Copper River Valley into southeast. Those levels are pretty high up there, but one area that's a little bit lower is around the Beaufort Sea coast. You'll see different levels there below 3,000 feet. There's plenty of moisture and cold air, and then a dry patch, and then above 6,000 feet there's a better chance for icing to continue there. And then we get into our next wave that's building that warm air in already, so above 10,000 feet is where we find the moisture and the cold for Bristol Bay all the way out toward the central and eastern chain. The jet stream is the reason why that's happening. You can see that southwesterly flow building in here. A ridge down across the North Pacific, a strong westerly flow feeding moisture into that, 100 to 120 knots blowing in from the west. And then a really elongated trough all the way down the west coast of North America, including southeast, controlling your weather here. A lot of Alaska, though, is getting in on the control part of the jet stream, blowing in from the south and west into the mainland, with a ridge of high pressure across western North America as well. 9,000 feet, you can see that southwesterly flow taking shape here, 15 to 20 knots, a ridge just over the western Gulf. Wind speeds coming in from that about 45 to 50, even 60 knots. Here's our trough of low pressure across the eastern Gulf, more of an offshore feature than for southeast, if anything. And south and westerlies blowing in across the western Bering Sea. Wind speeds are a little bit lighter at 3,000 feet, anywhere from 5 to 15 knots. Southwesterlies across the western Gulf. Here's our low pressure trough again across southeast, 20 to 30 knots there. And south and easterly flow across the southern Bering Sea, northerly so across the western chain. With all that, there really isn't a whole lot to talk about for turbulence. Just hit and miss chop areas across southern southeast, the eastern Alaska Range, west of St. Lawrence Island to St. Matthew in the Gulf of Anadyr. Probably our more notable spot will be around Sandpoint to the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula, below about 4,000 feet, and maybe some light to occasionally moderate chop across the central and eastern parts of the chain. That's a look at your turbulence there, not a whole lot to talk about. We'll be back in just a few minutes with a look at your marine forecast, and we certainly hope you'll stay with us.
Leatherbacks are the largest turtles on Earth, growing up to 7 feet long and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. These sea turtles are among the most highly migratory animals on Earth, some traveling up to 10,000 miles a year between their nesting and feeding grounds. Prevalent in every ocean except the Arctic and Antarctic, the species overall is declining, more so in the Pacific. In the eastern Pacific, the Mexican population was once thought to be the largest in the world and has experienced an alarming decline.
This trajectory of decline that we've seen and actually collapse. We're talking about only 20 or 30 turtles nesting every year, where thousands used to just 40 years ago. That's the kind of dramatic decline.
The western Pacific population has been declining steadily, and it's particularly critical to act now before it collapses, while there are enough turtles in nests to respond to conservation measures. But threats to all leatherbacks in the Pacific need to be addressed.
The top threats to populations are uncontrolled coastal development, all the bad stuff on the nesting beaches, egg harvest, poaching of the females, predation on the eggs by dogs and pigs. Deforestation makes the sand too warm and dry and the eggs don't hatch. Another one is incidental capture in fishing gear. During their vast migrations, they get caught in fishing gear throughout the Pacific. And finally, marine debris, which the leatherbacks mistake for their favorite food, jellyfish, and they choke on those.
Protecting leatherbacks in U.S. waters alone is not enough to ensure the continued existence of the species. The highly migratory nature of Pacific leatherbacks requires cooperation and international collaboration. NOAA is focusing on partnerships with Mexico, Central America, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands in the Pacific.
Our action plan promotes a holistic recovery strategy that addresses all the sources of mortality. So that's basically ensuring that the remaining nesting sites are protected. And the nests produce as many hatchlings as possible. And then secondly, in tandem with that, is reducing the fisheries-related mortalities. We're working with international partners to incentivize community participation on the nesting beach conservation and developing alternative livelihood programs that wean communities off leatherback resources and introduce alternative methods for food and income. Recovery is going to take a long time, on the order of 20 to 30 years at least, before we see some of these actions bear fruit. But here in the US, we can all help leatherbacks by making seafood choices, for instance, that support sustainable fishing practices. And beachgoers can certainly do their part by keeping our oceans clean of plastic debris, picking up marine litter, particularly plastic bags.
Together with our partners, we are strengthening protection and conservation efforts to ensure a future for leatherbacks, helping them to survive and once again thrive in the waters of the Pacific Ocean.
For over 40 years, NOAA scientists have been collecting data and piecing together the story of the gray whale. Each year, new discoveries are made, revealing the secrets of this ancient traveler. With the northeastern Pacific population recovered, leading scientists from the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center continue their research efforts to help save the western population from extinction. The most effective way to identify individuals and count the population is to photograph them from the surface. Using the gray whale's distinctive markings and gray spots caused by parasites on their skin, scientists document these characteristics to identify individuals.
So we're able to track migratory pathways and corridors by the simple use of photo identification. There are other ways to do that as well, biopsy sampling and genetics.
And from the air.
Aerial photography is one way you can study animals based on their size and shape. So you can learn a lot about nutritive and reproductive condition of whales just by measuring their size and shape from vertical aerial photographs.
You can also put satellite transmitters on them and track them remotely. You put the transmitter on and let them go, and you watch them move across the Pacific or down to China or wherever it might be.
To further learn and discover where these great sojourners swim, the team of researchers traveled to Russia and set up camp on Sakhalin Island.
The main focus of our research while we were on Sakhalin was to collect photo identification. If it was a whale that we had not collected a genetic sample from previously, we would also attempt to collect a sample from the whales.
Whereas whales are endowed with natural insulation, their human observers must gear up to brave the cold in order to study these marine giants up close.
We're typically only able to work about 1/3 of the time that we're there, and that's mostly due to this fog that just invades the area and sits sometimes for weeks on end. So it can be very challenging to try and do field work in this site.
Recently, 2 whales from the western population surprised scientists by migrating across the Pacific to the waters of California and Mexico.
It's a really fun finding. It's added another piece to the puzzle that we didn't previously know about. And I would have to say that it's opened up more questions than we had before.
Research scientists from Japan, Russia, and the United States share images of animals they've spotted.
We take a photograph of an individual off of Sakhalin Island, and we get a phone call from Japanese scientists, and they say, hey, guess what? We've got a picture of a gray whale in Japan. We say, can you send it to us? We'd love to try and match it. They'll send us the picture, we'll compare it to our catalog, and we'll say, hey, we've got a match from Sakhalin to Japan.
Unlike many species of whales that still remain on the endangered species list, the eastern Pacific gray whale, once on the brink of extinction, now numbers about 20,000 individuals. Recovery efforts that started 40 years ago and the ongoing research and monitoring by NOAA scientists have contributed to the conservation of the gray whales. Together, with legal protection and public education, scientists are playing their part to ensure the survival of this magnificent migratory animal.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
On to today's sea ice edge. You'll notice the higher concentration ice now surrounding St. Lawrence Island and all the way down the southwest coast. There's not a lot of it, but it is a little bit thicker and more concentrated across the coastline. That's good, and it goes into Bristol Bay. You'll notice a very thin ribbon of marginal ice. The areas that we see that might have a little bit more trouble in the next couple days will be when that next southwesterly storm moves into Bristol Bay. Watch for some changes here in southwest, and there will be some warmer air that lifts northward as well. In Cook Inlet, a lot of marginal ice, but not very high concentrations of it across some parts of the northern Cook Inlet region. This updated this afternoon. As always, you can check this out anytime by going to weather.gov/Anchorage/ice. On to southeast now. Light winds and small seas for Wednesday. Northerlies coming down the Lynn Canal into Stevens Passage. About 2 to 4 foot seas expected there. 5 to 15 mile-an-hour winds, or knots, I should say, across the region. On the outer coast, an offshore flow, 15 to about 25 knots at the highest outside of Dixon Entrance. Looking for 8 to about 11 foot seas there on Wednesday. And then we get into a slightly stronger flow coming in from the north and west. Remember, the trough was passing through behind that. Northerlies coming down the Lynn Canal and Stevens Passage, 15 to 25 there, with seas holding around 3 to 5 feet or so. The outer coast, you're looking at seas from about 6 to 9 foot seas. Small craft advisories across the outer coast. For Wednesday, light winds inside of Prince William Sound across the northern Gulf, 15 to 20 knots, looking for 7 foot seas on the outside. Ice up north, but then 1 to 3 foot seas down in the southern part of Cook Inlet for Wednesday. As we get into Thursday, the winds start to pick up a little bit more ahead of the advancing system out in the west, and because of that, you'll start to see seas coming up to about 6 to 9 feet around the Barren Islands. Again, 25 to 30 knots in that region, looking for northeasterlies, 10 knots and 2 foot seas inside of Prince William Sound on Thursday. We'll see some bigger changes here. Inside of Bristol Bay, northeasterlies there, 15 knots and 3 foot seas in ice-free waters. Easterlies across the southern Alaska Peninsula coastline down the Bering Sea, 25 knots with a 5 foot sea there. And then we get into our southerlies across the Pacific, 15 to 25, 7 to 9 foot seas. And light winds across Shelikof Strait up to 15 knots with 3 foot seas there. And that continues east of Kodiak Island. For Thursday, you'll notice that southwesterly flow is already impacting the region, south and west of AKwx down to Chignik and Sand Point. You're looking at 30 knots with 9 to 14 foot seas. Southeasterlies inside of Bristol Bay, northwesterlies on the other side of the low pressure system with 11 foot seas and winds up to 30 knots down the Bering Sea coast of the Alaska Peninsula. Look for an east and northeasterly flow wrapping into the low pressure system on Wednesday south of the central and eastern chain. Most areas are looking at winds from 25 to 30 knots or so. More of a southerly flow already returning out west with 6-foot seas across Kiska and Attu. As we get into Thursday, we're back into that north and westerly flow wrapping into low pressure that's moving up toward Bristol Bay. Seas holding from about 10 to nearly 13 feet across the eastern chain, but out west, the next weather system is already changing the winds around to a south and easterly flow. 10 to 16-foot seas expected there, with winds coming up to 25 to 35 knots by the end of Thursday. Across the west coast, there's plenty of high concentration ice here, so you won't see any seas, but look for winds around 10 to 20 knots or so on either side of Nunivak Island up through Macquarie, northwesterly south of St. Lawrence, and westerly winds at 15 knots inside of Norton Sound. Northeasterly winds around the Pribilofs, 15 knots with a 4-foot sea. Strengthening as we get into Thursday, northerlies 25 knots with a 7-foot sea. Northerlies north of Macquarie and Nunivak Island and into the Kuskokwim Delta region, 8-foot seas expected there. Northerlies inside of Norton Sound, 10 knots expected there for your Thursday afternoon. Across the North Slope, easterlies over the Beaufort Sea, 20 to 30 knots expected. As we get around the Chukchi Seacoast, 20 to 30 knots coming in from the north and northwest. Looking for northwesterlies south of the Bering Strait, 20 knots there over the ice. As we get into Thursday, winds will diminish there down to about 10 knots. Look for a southwesterly flow coming into Kotzebue Sound, 10 to 15 knots there. And winds mainly from the west from Prudhoe Bay to Kaktovik, but still holding onto an east and northerly component from Barrow down toward Point Lay at about 15 knots or so for your Thursday. Let's recap tonight's weather. Many areas will be looking at some light snow showers or light snow just passing through across the mainland. The best chance will be ahead of these areas of low pressure as they're moving to the east. Now, this one's moving from east to west. Across southern parts of southeast, a very warm day, probably a mild night. You'll see a better chance of rain as we get into Wednesday. And we're watching the next weather system coming out of the North Pacific. That will be heading towards southwestern Alaska, bringing a pretty good chance for accumulating snow for places in the upper Kuskokwim Valley around McGrath. You might see as much as 7 to 12 inches of snow, and in some areas as much as 17. The best chance of that accumulating snow starts Thursday morning. Down the middle Yukon Valley toward Grayling, the lower Yukon, expect 4 to 9 inches of snow again. That starts on Thursday. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather. See you tomorrow.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.